we will journey through the entire history of Iceland. All you need to do is rest, listen, and feel yourself float along with the story, as softly as a lantern drifting across dark waters. You are safe now. Let us go back in time, deep into the mists of Iceland's beginnings. Before any human eyes beheld it, Iceland was already alive, sculpted by immense forces of the earth. Imagine, long before memory, the slow churning of tectonic plates beneath the ocean floor. From the dark depths of the mid-Atlantic ridge, molten rock rose, searing and relentless, breaking through the sea to form jagged land. Volcanoes rumbled, and lava spread like glowing rivers, meeting the cold embrace of the Arctic air. Over thousands of years, this dance of fire and frost gave birth to a raw, untamed island. Black basalt cliffs rose from the sea, glaciers crept down mountainsides, and geysers hissed with steam. The land seemed to breathe, to stir, to grow not static, but always shifting. In the silence of those early millennia, life took root. Moss clung to volcanic rock, hardy and green, like the first threads of a vast tapestry. Birds came, wheeling and calling, filling the cliffs with colonies of puffins, guillemots, and fulmars. Seals lazed on icy shores, and later, whales glided through the frigid waters. It was a land both barren and abundant, forbidding yet strangely inviting, as if waiting for stories to be told upon its soil. And in the imagination of peoples far away, stories indeed began. In the Norse world, to the east, across the seas, there were tales of lands born from the meeting of fire and ice, echoing the very creation myths of their gods. According to the old stories of the Eddas, before the world was shaped, there was Ginnungagap, the yawning void, bordered by the fiery realm of Muspelheim on one side, and the icy wasteland of Niflheim on the other. When fire and ice met, the first giant, Ymir, was formed, and from his body the world was made. Iceland, with its smoking volcanoes and glittering glaciers, seemed a living reflection of that myth, as though it had sprung directly from the primeval clash of elements. As centuries passed, whispers spread among sailors of strange lands glimpsed in the far Atlantic. Some spoke of Irish monks, wandering ascetics who sought solitude in the most remote places, sailing westward in their small boats, guided only by faith and the stars. It is said that some may have reached Iceland as early as the 8th century, long before the Norse. These hermits, known as Pepar, left little traceable haps stone huts, perhaps crosses carved into rock, faint echoes that faded when the Norse arrived. They came not to build kingdoms, but to dwell in silence, to pray where the world itself seemed untouched. But it was the Norse who would give Iceland its voice, its people, its sagas. In the late 9th century, drawn by both curiosity and necessity, settlers from Norway and beyond turned their sails toward the land of fire and ice. Picture the scene: a long ship cutting across the steel-gray waves, its dragon-headed prow rising and falling with the swell. The salty spray stings the air, the wind hums in the rigging, and on the horizon, a dark shape looms, mountains streaked with snow, cliffs like fortress walls, and beyond them, valleys promising both challenge and sustenance. The land, Mobach, or Book of Settlements, would later record their names, their stories, their claims to the land. According to tradition, the first permanent Norse settler was Arnarsson, who around 874 cast the carved pillars of his high seat overboard as his ship neared the coast, vowing to build his home where they washed ashore. They drifted into a bay ringed with mountains, and there he made his settlement, a place still known today as the Smoky Bay, named for the steam rising from its hot springs. Life in this new land was harsh, yet it held a strange allure. The settlers brought with them livestock, sheep, cattle, horses' seeds for crops, tools of iron, and above all, traditions of governance and storytelling. They built turf houses, their walls thick with sod, blending almost seamlessly into the earth, warm against the bitter winds. They learned to endure the long, dark winters when daylight was but a brief glow, and to rejoice in the endless summer days when the sun barely touched the horizon. But Iceland was more than a refuge. It became a canvas upon which a unique society could be painted. Here, no kings ruled, no towering castles were built. Instead, chieftains shared power, and law was spoken aloud, remembered, and recited under the open sky. Stories and laws alike were carried in the memory of the people, woven together with poetry, with sagas, with myth. Even in these earliest days, the island inspired a culture deeply tied to both its harshness and its beauty. To walk upon its black sand shores, to see the northern lights shimmering like green veils across the winter sky, to hear the thunder of waterfalls plunging from icy cliffs, these experiences etched themselves into the hearts of the settlers, into the rhythm of their lives. In Iceland, every stone, every storm, every star seemed to hold meaning, as if the land itself was alive, whispering to those who would listen. And so, Iceland's story began, not with battles and empires, but with a meeting of nature and myth, with settlers carving out homes in a land that was still raw and wild. This land, born of fire and ice, would give rise to one of the most unique societies in the medieval world, a place where democracy took root, where sagas were sung, and where history itself would be written in a voice unlike any other. The land was young, yet the society that took root upon it carried with it centuries of tradition from across the sea. The Norse who settled in Iceland brought not only their livestock and tools, but also their sense of law, honor, and community. Unlike Norway, where kings ruled with increasing power, Iceland offered something different, an opportunity to build a society without a throne, without a monarch. A society where power might be shared, where the voice of the people could rise together like the sound of many rivers flowing into the same sea. By the year 930, the settlers had established a gathering that would become one of the oldest parliaments in the world, the Althingi, held at a place called Lyngvellir, the assembly plains. Imagine the scene: a broad valley flanked by ridges of volcanic stone, a place where the earth itself is torn apart by rifts, as if two worlds were pulling away from each other. In summer, the people came here from every corner of the island, riding on sturdy Icelandic horses, leading their sheep and cattle, carrying tents, goods, and family. They set up booths of turf and cloth, creating a temporary city that thrived for weeks beneath the open sky. The law speaker, chosen by the people, stood upon the Lagberg, the law rock, and recited aloud the laws of the land. There were no written statutes, yet only memory, preserved through careful repetition, passed down like poetry. Around him, chieftains and free farmers listened, argued, bargained, and made judgments. Disputes were settled, marriages arranged, alliances formed. It was a parliament, but it was also a festival, a gathering of culture and kinship where news spread, poems were recited, and the pulse of Icelandic society could be felt. This, too, was part of Iceland's uniqueness, the blending of governance and oral tradition. For in Iceland, stories were as vital as laws. The people treasured their skalds poets, who could weave words like magic, who carried the memory of gods and heroes, and who could sharpen their verses like weapons. Skaldic poetry, intricate and filled with kennings, those layered metaphors that turned a ship into a sea steed, or blood into battle sweat, flourished in the halls of chieftains. And later, these oral traditions would be written down as sagas, the great epics of Iceland, unlike anything else in medieval Europe. The settlement age, stretching through the 9th and 10th centuries, was a time of exploration, of carving boundaries, of discovering how to survive upon this island. Families spread into fertile valleys, each claiming land, sometimes peacefully, sometimes with conflict. The Book of Settlements tells of quarrels that flared into feuds, of cattle raids, of duels fought by riversides. Yet these tales were not merely violence, they were also about honor, about the delicate weaving of alliances, about how a society balanced freedom with responsibility. And while Iceland's human community was forming, its natural world continued to shape its destiny. The island's fragile environment was quickly strained. Forests of birch, once covering much of the land, were cut down for timber and firewood, leaving slopes bare and vulnerable to erosion. Winters could be long and cruel, and famine was always a possibility. Yet the settlers endured, adapting their way of life to the rhythms of the island. Sheep became the lifeblood of their economy, providing wool for clothing, meat for sustenance, and trade goods for barter with foreign merchants. Fishing, too, became vital, though in these early centuries, it was not yet the vast industry it would later become. Amidst this harshness, Iceland remained connected to the wider Norse world. Traders came, ships crossed the seas, and stories spread. Icelanders traveled abroad, as well many became mercenaries in foreign lands, or settlers in Greenland, or even voyagers further west. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of the Greenlander Eric the Red, set out from these northern settlements and reached a place he called Vinland, believed by many to be in North America. Thus, through its people, Iceland's spirit touched lands across oceans, extending its story far beyond its own shores. But closer to home, a transformation was stirring, one that would alter Icelandic society profoundly: the arrival of Christianity. For centuries, the settlers had honored the old god Sodin, Thor. Freyjand, their festivals were marked by rituals to secure harvests, to ensure safe voyages, to honor the unseen powers woven into the world. Temples of wood were built, sacrifices made, and the myths of the Eddas shaped their understanding of life and death. Yet, in the year 1000, at the Althingi, a remarkable decision was made. After much debate, after tensions that threatened to divide the people, it was agreed that Iceland would convert to Christianity, not through conquest or the decree of a king, but through consensus. It is said that the law speaker Wargeir I lay beneath a cloak for a day and a night, contemplating the choice, and when he rose, he declared that all Icelanders should be baptized, while still allowing some private worship of the old gods for a time. Thus, the island turned to the new faith, but in a way that preserved peace, that allowed the society to remain whole. The churches that arose were small, built of wood and turf, humble yet enduring. Monks and priests began to teach letters, and soon Iceland would become one of the most literate societies of the medieval world. Here, on this remote island, far from Rome or Constantinople, the act of writing took hold with a fervor. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the sagas were being written, those prose epics of family feuds, of voyages, of heroes and tricksters, of gods and kings. The sagas of Icelanders, like Saga and Eagle's Saga, are among the treasures of world literature, capturing with stark clarity the lives of ordinary men and women against the backdrop of an unforgiving land. Think of it, by the light of oil lamps on soft parchment made from calfskin, scribes carefully copied words that had once been only sound, only memory. The flicker of flame, the scratch of quill, the hush of concentration, these became the instruments by which Iceland gave its voice to the world. While much of medieval Europe celebrated knights and castles, Iceland celebrated farmers, poets, and law speakers. It was a society both fragile and profound, forged not in marble halls, but in the intimacy of storytelling. And so, as the 11th and 12th centuries passed, Iceland stood as both remote and central. Remote in its distance from Europe, centers of power, yet central in its cultural contributions. A place where one of the world's earliest parliaments met, where Christianity blended with old traditions, and where stories were carved into the fabric of memory with words that still echo today. As the centuries turned, Iceland's society grew more intricate, its stories more layered. The period from the 10th through the 13th centuries came to be known as the Icelandic Commonwealth, or Free State. It was a unique experiment in governance, a land without a king, bound instead by laws spoken aloud at the Althingi and by the agreements of its chieftains, called Gögur. In no other part of Europe was there such a society, where power was so diffused, and where a people governed themselves beneath the wide sky and shifting clouds. Yet this system, while remarkable, was also fragile. Without a monarch to unify them, the chieftains often clashed. The sagas tell of these feuds, tales where personal honor, family pride, and old grievances would spark cycles of vengeance. A slighted insult, an unpaid dowry, a disputed sheep pasture could ignite conflicts that rippled through generations. These stories, preserved in works like Saga, reveal the tension between law and feud, between order and chaos. And though they recount bloodshed, they also show the extraordinary depth of Iceland as storytelling. Here were not distant kings or legendary giants, but ordinary people rendered with all their flaws, passions, and hopes. During this age, Iceland remained outward-looking, its ties to Norway, the British Isles, and Greenland still strong. Traders came with goods, timber, grain, iron, and carried back Iceland's prized exports, wool, fish, and falcons, those noble birds sought after by European courts. Iceland's isolation was softened by these exchanges, yet its remoteness preserved its independence. But by the 13th century, the balance of the Commonwealth began to falter. Wealth and power grew concentrated in fewer hands, and rival clans, particularly the Sturlungs, Adaverger, and Asperninger, struggled for dominance. This turbulent era, remembered as the Sturlunga Age, was marked by civil strife. Families raised armies, battles erupted across valleys, and blood was spilled upon the lava fields. The sagas of this age, such as the Sturlunga saga, preserve a haunting record of the violence, written with a clarity that makes the events feel near, almost palpable. Men riding through the mist, swords flashing, shields splintering, fires consuming homesteads in the night. Amid these struggles, one figure stands out: Snorri Sturluson, a chieftain, poet, and historian whose writings would shape the memory of the Norse world. Born in 1179, Snorri rose to prominence as both a political leader and a literary master. He composed the Prose Edda, a guide to Norse mythology and skaldic poetry, preserving myths of Odin, Thor, and Loki that might otherwise have vanished. He also authored Heimskringla, a sweeping history of the kings of Norway. In Snorri, we see Iceland's paradox, a land small and fragile, yet capable of producing voices that still echo across centuries. And yet, Snorri himself became enmeshed in the conflicts of his time, his alliances drawing him into Norway's sphere. In 1241, he was killed at his home in Reykholt, his life ending violently, even as his words endured. The turbulence of the Sturlunga age weakened the Commonwealth. Norway's kings, watching from across the sea, saw opportunity. They had long desired to bring Iceland under their rule, and as the chieftain's power fractured, the path became clear. In 1262, after years of pressure and negotiation, Icelanders agreed to the Old Covenant Gamli Setmali, submitting to the authority of the Norwegian crown. The decision was made, as so often in Iceland, at the Althingi, not by conquest, but by consensus. Weary of strife and seeking stability. Thus, Iceland entered a new chapter, its independence softened, its fate tied to larger kingdoms. Under Norwegian rule, the Althingi continued, but ultimate authority lay across the sea. At first, the change was not drastic. Words still recited, sagas still written, farms still tended. Yet, the island's identity shifted, now bound to powers beyond its shores. And still, the land itself continued its quiet shaping of life. The volcanic soil, rich yet unpredictable, could yield bounty or destruction. Eruptions sent ash clouds across the sky, while earthquakes shook the ground. Glaciers advanced and retreated, grinding stone to sand, carving valleys anew. To live in Iceland was always to live in dialogue with the earth, to endure its storms, to rebuild after its fires, to adapt to its endless changes. One curious detail of this medieval period lies in the art of navigation. Icelanders, like their Norse kin, were skilled sailors, venturing across uncertain seas, guided not by compasses, but by the sun, the stars, and perhaps even by sunstone's crystals, said to reveal the position of the hidden sun on cloudy days. Though part legend, evidence suggests that such stones may indeed have been used. A reminder of the ingenuity required to survive in a world where the horizon often seemed endless. By the late Middle Ages, Iceland's connection to Norway also meant connection to a growing union of Scandinavian crowns. In 1380, when Norway entered union with Denmark, Iceland too became linked to Danish rule, a tie that would last for centuries. For a time, life continued with little change, but the shadow of distance grew heavier. Supplies were irregular, trade increasingly controlled by foreign merchants, and Iceland's isolation became a burden. Yet, through all of this, the sagas endured. They were copied, cherished, recited, and passed down. These stories of heroes like Greta, the strong, of tragic feuds, of journeys across seas, were not mere entertainment, but the soul of Iceland, a way of carrying memory across generations. And even in hardship, the people clung to their words, their gatherings, their sense of shared identity. Picture, in the long dark of a winter's night, a family gathered inside a turf house. The walls are thick with earth and stone, the roof low, the fire flickering in the hearth. Inside, warmth spreads from the fire, and someone begins to recite a saga learned by heart, spoken aloud in the rhythm of tradition. The children listen, the elders nod, the words painting landscapes of battle and bravery, love and loss. This was how Iceland preserved itself, not only through survival of the body, but through the survival of memory, of culture, of story. And so, by the close of the Middle Ages, Iceland stood at a crossroads, no longer independent, yet not wholly lost, ruled from afar, yet still profoundly itself. A land of farmers and poets, of ash and ice, of struggle and endurance. It was a society unlike any other, perched on the edge of the known world, carrying forward a voice that would never be silenced. When Iceland entered the orbit of Norway, and later Denmark, the rhythms of life upon the island changed slowly, yet profoundly. Unlike kingdoms of Europe, where courts glittered and cities thrived, Iceland remained rural, scattered with farms and small communities, bound together by the Althingi, by kinship, and by the enduring pulse of oral tradition. Yet, as Danish influence deepened, the island's independence faded. Its people subject to rulers across the sea, often distant in both geography and understanding. The late Middle Ages brought challenges that tested the resilience of the Icelanders. In the 14th century, the Black Death swept through Europe, decimating populations. Iceland, though remote, was not spared. Ships carried the sickness to its shores, and entire communities vanished. Some valleys fell silent, farms abandoned, fields untended, as if the land itself had withdrawn into mourning. The isolation that had once protected Iceland now could not shield it from the plague's invisible reach. As the centuries passed, the currents of faith also shifted. The Reformation, sweeping across Europe in the 16th century, found its way to Iceland through Danish authority. For centuries, Iceland had been steadfastly Catholic. Its monasteries, small yet vital centers of learning, where manuscripts were copied, prayers recited, and the Latin faith entwined with local traditions. But Denmark, under King Christian III, embraced Lutheranism, and soon Iceland was compelled to follow. The transition was not smooth. Bishops resisted, clinging to the old ways. One bishop, Arason of, became a symbol of defiance, a man of learning, poetry, and politics. He resisted the imposition of the new faith, rallying support against Danish decrees. But in 1550, he was captured, and together with his two sons, was executed by beheading in. Their blood on the ground marked the end of Catholic Iceland, and Lutheranism took firm root. The churches changed, monasteries dissolved, but still the Althingi met. Still sagas were cherished, still the people endured. These were centuries of hardship. The climate grew colder, part of the period known as the Little Ice Age. Winters lengthened, glaciers advanced, and crops withered. Volcanic eruptions darkened skies, poisoned fields with ash, and sent floods of melted ice sweeping across farmlands. Life became precarious. Every year, a negotiation with survival. Famine returned again and again, and many looked to the sea for sustenance, turning more and more to fishing, though the harsh waters claimed many lives. And yet, through all of this, the Icelandic spirit persisted. The people adapted, building homes deeper into the earth, turf walls insulating against the brutal winds, smoke curling from low chimneys into the cold sky. They clothed themselves in thick wool, carded, spun, and woven from the backs of hardy sheep that grazed upon sparse pastures. They relied on each other, on kinship ties, on the steady pulse of community. And always, stories filled the dark nights, spoken in voices soft and steady, carrying warmth when the hearth fire burned low. But Denmark's hold tightened, particularly through control of trade. By the 17th century, Iceland had been placed under a trade monopoly, with Danish merchants holding exclusive rights to buy and sell goods on the island. No longer could Icelanders freely exchange with English or German traders, who once frequented their shores. Prices were set, options limited, and the people grew poorer. Complaints reached Copenhagen, yet little changed and for centuries, Iceland remained bound by this restrictive system. It was also during these centuries that folklore flourished, shaped by hardship and isolation. Belief in the hidden people became widespread. Stories of elves and spirits dwelling in rocks, hills, and lava fields. These were not mere fairy tales, but reflections of a worldview in which the land itself was alive, infused with presences unseen yet deeply felt. Travelers avoided disturbing certain boulders said to be homes of elves, and builders sometimes left gaps in walls for the hidden folk to pass through. In this way, imagination softened the harshness of reality, turning the bleak landscape into something enchanted, mysterious, and shared with unseen companions. At the same time, Iceland's intellectual life did not vanish. Though poor, though battered by famine and monopoly, the people clung to learning. Manuscripts were still copied, sagas still studied, Latin and later Danish texts translated. Poetry remained central, not only the ancient skaldic forms, but also new styles that merged devotion, satire, and wit. Icelanders, often without wealth or power, wielded words as their enduring inheritance. The 18th century brought disasters that etched themselves into memory. In 1707, smallpox struck, carried by ships, killing nearly half the population. Villages were emptied, valleys silenced once more by grief. Yet the land itself seemed to conspire in suffering. In 1783, the Loki eruption began a cataclysm of fire and ash that spewed forth for 8 long months. Lava flows destroyed farms, but it was the gases released that proved most devastating. Sulfuric haze settled over the island, poisoning pastures, killing livestock, and leading to famine. The skies grew dim, the sun a pale disk through a veil of ash. It is said that 1/4 of Iceland's people perished in the years that followed, their lives claimed by hunger, disease, and despair. The haze drifted far beyond Iceland, darkening skies in Europe, cooling temperatures, and even disrupting harvests as far away as Asia. In this way, Iceland's suffering touched the world. And yet, once again, Iceland endured. Though diminished, though bowed by calamity, the people rebuilt, the grass regrew upon cooled lava, and life crept back into the valleys. The memory of Loki lingered, passed down in somber tales, but so too did the resilience of those who survived. It was in such endurance that Iceland's identity was forged, not in conquest or empire, but in the quiet, stubborn will to remain. By the late 18th century, however, a shift was beginning. The Enlightenment, with its ideas of reason, reform, and national identity, reached even this far island. Danish officials, inspired by new philosophies, began to take interest in improving conditions, establishing schools, and studying the unique geology and natural history of Iceland. Travelers came, scientists and explorers, marveling at geysers, glaciers, and volcanoes. Iceland, long seen as a poor outpost, began to attract curiosity as a land of natural wonder, a place where the Earth's raw forces could be witnessed as if on the day of creation. Within Iceland itself, seeds of a new consciousness were stirring. The hardships endured, the sagas remembered. The uniqueness of their language and culture, these became the foundation for a growing sense of national identity. The centuries of foreign rule had not erased the memory of independence, nor the pride of a people who once governed themselves beneath the open sky. That memory remained quiet but unyielding, waiting for the day when it could rise again. The 19th century dawned with Iceland still under Danish rule, still poor, still scarred by famine and disaster. The memory of the Loki eruption lingered, and the struggles of survival continued with each harsh winter. Yet, the new century also brought winds of change, subtle at first, like the stirring of spring air after long darkness, but soon carrying with them the promise of transformation. Europe was entering an age of revolutions, of romanticism, of nations rediscovering their pasts and envisioning futures shaped by their own people. Across the continent, poets and philosophers urged their countries to seek independence, to take pride in language and culture, to reclaim heritage as a source of strength. And even here, in distant Iceland, these ideas took root. The people of Iceland had always cherished their language, the old Norse tongue that had evolved into Icelandic, still so close to the speech of the sagas that a farmer in the 19th century could read manuscripts written centuries before and hear his own voice reflected in them. This continuity became a source of pride, a sign that, despite hardship and foreign rule, something essential had endured unbroken. Language, literature, and memory became the soil in which Iceland's nationalism would grow. One of the first sparks was lit by Rasmus Christian Rask, a Danish linguist who in the early 1800s recognized the richness of Icelandic and its value in understanding the ancient roots of European languages. His work inspired Icelanders themselves to treasure their tongue anew, and soon scholars and poets began to speak of reviving not only language, but the dignity of their nation. Among the voices of this awakening was poet, naturalist, and romantic visionary. Born in 1807, he studied abroad but carried Iceland in his heart, writing poems that celebrated the beauty of its landscapes, the majesty of its volcanoes, the resilience of its people. Through his verse, Icelanders were reminded that their land was not only a place of hardship, but of wonder, worthy of pride and reverence. He helped found a journal, Fjolnir, which published essays and poems calling for cultural renewal, for education, for progress. Though died young in 1845, his words became immortal, fueling the spirit of a generation. At the same time, a figure of politics emerged, Sigurdsson, born in 1811, who would become the leader of Iceland's independence movement. Learned and eloquent, devoted his life to the cause of greater autonomy for his people. From Copenhagen, where he spent much of his life, he argued tirelessly for Iceland's rights, for the preservation of the Althingi, for reforms in governance and trade. His voice carried across the sea, inspiring Icelanders to believe that their destiny was not forever bound to Denmark. To this day, on June 17th, S. birthday, Iceland celebrates its National Day, honoring the man who symbolized their long struggle for freedom. The Althingi itself, though diminished over the centuries, survived in 1845 as a consultative assembly, a sign of Denmark's recognition of Iceland's unique identity. Though its power was limited, its very existence rekindled the memory of the old Commonwealth, of the gathering at Lyngvellir, where laws had once been spoken beneath the open sky. Now, once again, the people could meet, debate, and envision their future together. The 19th century also brought the beginnings of modernization. Education spread, literacy, already high, became nearly universal. Icelanders, though poor, were among the most literate peoples in Europe, their hunger for books and learning unquenched. Printing presses produced new works, from poetry to practical guides. The sagas continued to be copied and studied, not merely as relics, but as foundations of identity. They reminded Icelanders that their ancestors had been free, that their society had once thrived without kings, and that they, too, might one day reclaim that freedom. Still, daily life remained harsh. Famines struck again, particularly in the 1860s, driving many to despair. In these years, thousands chose to emigrate, seeking better lives in North America, especially in Canada's Manitoba and the United States. Their departure was bittersweet, for though they carried Icelandic language and culture with them, their absence left empty valleys and abandoned farms. Yet even abroad, the dream of Iceland's independence lingered, cherished by those who still called the island home in their hearts. The landscape of Iceland, too, shaped the 9th century awakening. Travelers from Europe came to witness its marvels: geysers shooting columns of steam into the air, waterfalls plunging in thunderous cascades, glaciers gleaming under endless summer sun. Artists and scientists painted, wrote, and marveled. and their accounts spread across Europe, casting Iceland as a land of sublime beauty, almost mythic in its majesty. These foreign eyes, awed by Iceland's natural wonders, helped Icelanders see their own land anew, not only as a place of survival, but as a treasure, a heritage unlike any other. The century closed with Iceland more self-aware, more determined. The movement for independence grew stronger, and in 1874, on the 1000th anniversary of the first settlement, Denmark granted Iceland a constitution and limited home rule. For the first time in centuries, Icelanders felt the stirrings of sovereignty return, like embers rekindled after long darkness. The celebration at Lingvlar that year was more than a ceremony, was a reminder that history had not forgotten them, that the dream of freedom still lived. In the decades that followed, reforms continued. Trade restrictions eased, agriculture modernized, and fishing began to emerge as the lifeblood of the economy. Steamships replaced sailing vessels, connecting Iceland more closely with the world. Schools expanded, and a new generation grew up not only remembering sagas, but also reading newspapers, novels, and scientific works. The 19th century had begun in poverty, famine, and subjugation. But it ended with hope, with progress, and with a stirring belief that Iceland could once again stand as a free nation. The people had endured centuries of hardship, and now their endurance blossomed into determination. And so, as the 20th century dawned, Iceland stood poised at the threshold of a new era, still under Danish rule, but with a voice of its own, a parliament reborn, a people united by language, story, and memory. The glaciers still gleamed, the volcanoes still rumbled, the turf houses still clung to hillsides. But the spirit of Iceland was rising quiet, steady, inevitable. The 20th century arrived with Iceland still bound to Denmark, but with a parliament reborn, a constitution in hand, and a spirit of national pride that burned brighter than the flickering oil lamps in turf houses. The old ways still lingered. Farmers tending sheep across the windswept fields. Fishermen braving the Arctic seas in sturdy boats. Families gathering at night to read aloud by dim candlelight. Yet change was everywhere, silent, steady, unstoppable. Fishing, once a subsistence pursuit, now became the very backbone of the economy. The cold waters that hugged Iceland's coasts teemed with cod, herring, and other fish, and as steam trawlers replaced wooden boats, Icelanders began to look outward, their catch reaching markets across Europe. With fish came wealth, and with wealth came transformation. Small towns swelled into bustling harbors. Reykjavik grew into a city of note, and prosperity began to loosen the iron grip of poverty that had haunted generations. The spirit of independence, nurtured in the 19th century, now pressed more insistently. In 1904, Iceland gained home rule, with its own minister residing in Reykjavik rather than Copenhagen. This moment, simple yet profound, marked the first real taste of self-governance in centuries. The Althingi's debates no longer echoed in the shadow of foreign oversight alone. They carried the authority of a people reclaiming their voice. The first decades of the new century unfolded with both promise and hardship. World War I disrupted trade, leaving Iceland vulnerable. Yet it also underscored the island's growing need for self-reliance. In 1918, a milestone was reached. The Act of Union with Denmark declared Iceland a sovereign state, united with Denmark only through a shared monarchy. On that day, Iceland as flagged the blue field with a red cross outlined in white was raised as the symbol of a nation reborn. The old dream of Sigurdsson and his generation had come to life. Not yet in full independence, but close, tantalizingly near. The interwar years saw further modernization. Roads were built across lava fields and moors, connecting once isolated farms and villages. Reykjavik sprouted new houses, schools, and shops, its streets echoing with the sound of motor cars, where once only horses trod. Electricity spread, replacing oil lamps with bright light that banished the winter gloom. The printing press thrived, and Icelandic literature, always beloved, found new voices, from novels that captured rural life to poetry that still echoed the rhythms of the Sagas. Yet fate, as so often in Iceland's history, was not without storms. The Great Depression struck in the 1930s, and Iceland's dependence on fish exports left it vulnerable to global markets. Poverty returned in many households, and emigration once more tempted some. Still, the people endured, as they always had, turning to the sea, the soil, and the shared memory of resilience. Then came World War II, a conflict that reached even this remote island. In 1940, Denmark was occupied by Nazi Germany, and suddenly, Iceland, though tied to Denmark, stood alone. Britain, fearing that Germany might seize this strategic island in the North Atlantic, occupied Iceland to prevent its use as a base. Later, in 1941, American forces replaced the British, establishing military bases on the island. For the first time, Iceland became a vital node in global affairs, its harbors and airfields crucial in the Battle of the Atlantic. The presence of foreign soldiers was both disruptive and transformative. Icelanders, long isolated, encountered new languages, goods, and technologies. Roads were improved, airports built, infrastructure expanded. The war accelerated modernization in ways peace had never managed. Yet, it also stirred debates about neutrality, about Iceland's place in the wider world. In 1944, as the war still raged, Iceland seized its moment. With Denmark unable to govern and the people ready, a referendum was held. By overwhelming majority, Icelanders voted to sever the last tie to Denmark and declare themselves a republic. On June 17, 1944, the birthday of Sigur's son, the flag of the Republic of Iceland was raised at Lyngvellir, the ancient site of the Althingi. In that moment, beneath the cliffs and skies that had witnessed 1,000 years of struggle, Iceland's independence was complete. The post-war years brought rapid transformation. Prosperity flowed from the fisheries, as modern trawlers and international demand made Iceland one of the wealthiest nations per capita. With prosperity came new opportunities. Education expanded, healthcare improved, homes grew warmer and brighter. Reykjavik, once a small town of turf and stone, blossomed into a modern city with theaters, universities, and bustling streets. Yet the sea that gave prosperity also sparked conflict. In the latter half of the century, Iceland fought a series of confrontations known as the Cod Wars with Britain over fishing rights in the North Atlantic. These disputes, stretching from the 1950s to the 1970s, saw Iceland extend its fishing limits, defending its lifeblood with fierce determination. Though the conflicts were tense, involving naval vessels and cut fishing nets, Iceland prevailed, securing exclusive control over its rich waters. These victories ensured the future of its fisheries and symbolized the nation's resolve to protect its sovereignty. During the Cold War, Iceland found itself again at a crossroads of world powers. The American base remained, making Iceland a key NATO member, despite its small size and military neutrality. This presence brought both economic benefit and political controversy, with many Icelanders uneasy about foreign troops on their soil. Yet the nation balanced carefully, maintaining its independence while playing its part in the broader defense of the West. Amid these global entanglements, Iceland continued to cherish its culture. Literature thrived with writers like Laxness, who in 1955 became Iceland's first Nobel Prize laureate in literature. His novels captured the spirit of the land and its people, weaving sagas of modern life with poetic depth. Music, too, flourished from folk traditions to modern experiments that would, in later decades, give rise to internationally acclaimed artists. By the mid-20th century, geothermal energy began to reshape daily life. The same fiery forces that had long threatened Iceland volcanoes, geysers, and hot springs were now harnessed to heat homes, provide electricity, and make greenhouses bloom with vegetables in the cold north. Iceland became a leader in renewable energy, turning its natural power into a gift for the future. Thus, the 20th century was an age of rebirth. Independence achieved, prosperity secured, modernity embraced. Yet beneath it all, the same essence endured: the sagas, still read in schools. The turf houses, still preserved as symbols of endurance. The mountains and glaciers, still watching silently over a people who had turned hardship into strength. The night deepens, and with it, we drift further toward the final chapters of Iceland's story. The late 20th and early 21st centuries, where tradition meets modernity, where global recognition grows, and where this small island continues to weave its dreamlike path beneath the northern lights. By the closing decades of the 20th century, Iceland stood transformed from the poor, famine-stricken island it had once been. Its independence secured, its fisheries protected, and its energy harnessed, Iceland had entered the global stage with confidence. Reykjavik had grown from a cluster of turf houses and stone dwellings into a lively capital where modern glass and concrete mingled with old timber houses painted in bright hues. Streets buzzed with bookstores and music halls. A nation that once seemed so distant and isolated now thrummed with vitality. The late century was an age of contrasts. The persistence of tradition alongside bold experimentation. The whisper of ancient sagas carried into the realm of new voices, new art, new expressions. On long winter nights, families still gathered to read aloud as they had done for centuries. But now their shelves held not only sagas, but also novels, poetry, newspapers, and works from abroad. Television flickered into homes, connecting the island to the wider world. Icelanders, once accustomed to the hush of remote isolation, began to feel themselves part of a global community. Culture became one of Iceland's greatest ambassadors. The Nobel Prize of Laxness had already shown the world that this small nation's literary voice could be vast and profound. His works, such as Independent People, reflected the hardships and stubborn dignity of rural life, resonating far beyond Iceland's shores. In the decades that followed, music too would carry Iceland's name across the globe. The ethereal voice of Björk, rising in the 1980s and 1990s, seemed to embody the very landscape of Iceland. Strange, beautiful, otherworldly. Later, bands like Seeger would weave soundscapes of haunting beauty, evoking glaciers, storms, and endless skies. Through art, Iceland projected not only its modern creativity, but also its ancient soul. Economically, Iceland prospered, though not without turbulence. The fisheries remained its lifeline, carefully managed to prevent overexploitation, making Iceland a model of sustainable practice. At the same time, new industries emerged. Banking and finance grew rapidly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, transforming Reykjavik into a hub of investment and international dealings. For a time, Iceland enjoyed extraordinary wealth. Its citizens, among the most prosperous in the world. Its capital city, gleaming with new buildings and vibrant nightlife. Yet prosperity, as always, came with fragility. In 2008, the global financial crisis struck Iceland with brutal force. Its overextended banks collapsed almost overnight, sending shockwaves through society. Ordinary people saw their savings threatened, their livelihoods shaken, their faith in the new order tested. Protests filled Reykjavik's streets, with citizens banging pots and pans in what came to be called the kitchenware revolution. Out of hardship, however, Iceland once again displayed resilience. The people demanded accountability, restructured their economy, and slowly, painfully rebuilt. Remarkably, Iceland not only survived but emerged stronger. Its crisis becoming an example to the world of recovery forged through determination and unity. Tourism, once a minor part of Iceland's life, blossomed in these years into a major pillar of the economy. Travelers from around the world came to witness the raw beauty of its landscapes, the black sands of Vik, the thunder of Gullfoss waterfall, the steaming geothermal fields of Hakadalur, the serene glow of the northern lights shimmering across winter skies. What had once been seen as hardship, the cold, the glaciers became treasures, wonders that drew millions to this island of fire and ice. Towns expanded, hotels rose, and roads filled with buses carrying awestruck visitors. Tourism brought wealth and opportunities, but also challenges, as Iceland sought to balance preservation with prosperity. To protect the fragile land that had always been its greatest inheritance. The late 20th and early 21st centuries also saw Iceland assert itself in matters of global importance. Geothermal and hydroelectric energy made the nation nearly self-sufficient in power, a beacon of renewable sustainability in an age of climate concern. Iceland's commitment to green energy drew admiration, and its experiments with environmental stewardship became models for other nations. Even its cuisine, once born of necessity, fermented shark, dried fish, rye bread baked in hot springs, found new appreciation as chefs reinvented traditional foods for modern palates. Politically, Iceland continued to navigate its place between independence and cooperation. As a member of NATO, but not the European Union, it charted its own course, fiercely protective of its sovereignty while engaged in global partnerships. Its people, long accustomed to self-reliance, remained wary of surrendering control, even as globalization deepened connections across borders. The turn of the millennium brought both quiet and spectacle. In 1986, Reykjavik had already captured the world's gaze when U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev met there. Their summit, a pivotal moment in the Cold War thaw. The world had seen that even this small island could serve as a crossroads of history. In the decades that followed, Iceland's role as host, mediator, and cultural beacon only grew. And yet, for all its modernity, Iceland never lost sight of its ancient roots. The sagas are still taught in schools, their heroes and chieftains still alive in the imaginations of children. The Althingi, though housed now in modern buildings, still claims the mantle of the world's oldest parliament. Lyngvalur, the rift valley where Europe and America's tectonic plates drift apart, still welcomes gatherings, its cliffs whispering of centuries past. The old turf houses are preserved as museums, reminders of the endurance that shaped the present. In our own time, Iceland has continued to enchant. From the eruption of Eyjafjallajökull in 2010, which sent clouds of ash drifting across Europe, grounding flights and reminding the world of nature's power, to the steady flow of visitors, drawn by the promise of northern lights and steaming lagoons, Iceland remains a land both timeless and immediate. Its culture thrives, its art inspires, its people adapt with resilience, humor, and pride. And so, beneath the shimmer of the aurora, Iceland's story unfolds even now, a tale of fire and ice, of hardship and triumph, of sagas told by hearth and sagas lived across centuries. It is a story of survival turned into strength, of memory carried into modernity, of a small island that has touched the world through the quiet endurance of its people and the eternal majesty of its land. The night deepens, the stars glimmer softly, and Iceland's journey continues. Eternal and unbroken, carried on the winds of the North Atlantic, whispered in the language of sagas, sung in the voices of a people who have always known how to endure, how to dream, how to stand beneath the northern lights and claim their place in history.